Mars here is reclining on his armor, which is symbolic of peace. And there are some fawns playing with his weapons and armor. One is even wearing his helmet. And he has been subdued by Venus. This fawn is blowing a conch in his ear, and he's not waking up, he is out cold. His strategically placed limp hand does mean what you think it means. And it's not even the only phallic joke in this painting. That javelin is strategically aimed toward a tree. And you know, Renaissance folks, they love their dick jokes. Hello there, this is Ina from Taproot Tarot, and today I want to talk to you about the anonymous Tarot of Paris. First, a little bit of backstory. I had never encountered this deck before a few months ago. I'm not sure how I missed the memo on it. There's information out there about it, but at the time that I first saw it, I had never seen anything like it, and I was like, what in the entire world is this? So back in April, I made a post about, or a video about the Lombardy Tarot, and a post on Instagram about the really cool death card in that deck. And Gergely, the creator of this tarot and the creator behind the Midnight Tarot Etsy shop, contacted me about their version of that death card, which, by the way, is really cool. And that got me thinking, you know, I've been following the Midnight Tarot Etsy shop forever. I have a bunch of their decks in my wish list. It's about time I went to that shop and bought something. So I went to the shop and I did not buy anything that was in my wish list because I saw this deck and I was like, what even is this? Honestly, my first thought was, you know how sometimes a forgery of a historical object will be put out there and people will think it's real, that kind of thing. So it didn't make sense with the historical tarot I had so far at that point been exposed to. So I decided to get that one instead of any of the ones that were on my wish list. I have a bunch of his tarots on my wish list because they're so great, but I couldn't resist this one. This is a nice restoration with good clean lines. Which is important because the original is really difficult to see. So after ordering that back in April, I decided I would really also like one of the original versions just to make better sense of this deck. There's a couple out there. There's a facsimile that is a vintage. You can see this hasn't been opened yet. And this is from Grimaud from the 80s. And it is a facsimile. There is another version made by Il Museo dei Tarocchi, which is a restoration, but closer to in style to this one. The lines are cleaned up, the colors are clarified a bit, but it isn't restored to the extent that this one is. That one does have a book with it, but I chose not to go that route, and I'll post a link to a review of that set. Normally I would love to have the book, but it sounds like the authors got a couple of things incorrect, and that they also really have kind of a Golden Dawn background and really wanted to layer on occult symbolism onto this deck. So I decided against that one, and this one was actually much more affordable too, even though it is a vintage copy. And the very cool thing is that I found it through Abe Books from a bookshop in Marseille. So you can see that this actually came from Marseille, France, which I think is so cool. I have a few decks from France, but this is the only one I have that came directly to me from Marseille. And that's just kind of neat to me. Oh, and here is one where they wrote a little note, which is so cool. And I actually received this one first, even though I ordered this one. This one does come from Hungary, so the shipping takes a little while, which is totally understandable. And since then, I've been trying to make sense of this deck by giving it some context. Obviously, I haven't opened this one yet, but I do have access to the images from it. And this one has been a big help with clarifying what's actually going on in the images. And a little bit of history first. This is the first complete deck from France that we still have in existence. The earliest, I should say. And it is also the earliest complete deck that has the Order of Triumphs that the Marseille Tarot has. So it has a lot of familiarity, but it also has a lot of differences that are worth noting. The official date that this deck was printed was about 1650, maybe a little bit earlier in the 1600s. However, it's very likely that the woodblocks themselves came significantly earlier. And I will share a link from a forum thread in the Tarot History forum that goes through the coats of arms featured in this deck and makes a really good case for it actually having been created in 1559. And that makes a lot of sense because there is another earlier tarot, the first French tarot that we know of, called the Catelin-Geoffroy tarot, named after its creator, the artist credited with the work. And it's from 1557 and is actually pretty similar to this. I mentioned in an earlier video that I had received a book that would really inform my deep dive on this deck, and this is it. And oh my goodness, it's called The Art of Tarot. It's by Christina Olson. And I had seen it around but had overlooked it because it really, there's no indication when you see an image of it of what size it is, so I didn't realize it was going to be this cute tiny little book. And it is an art book, an art history book. And I didn't realize that based on the cover. So in researching this deck, I have scoured the internet through comment sections and forum threads and all sorts of things, blog posts, you name it, to find out information about this deck. So somewhere random, I found out that the Catelin-Geoffroy deck is pictured in this book. So I went ahead and picked up a copy. And I recommend it highly. The first section is on the courtly Italian tarots. And then the next section is on decks that are mass-produced. It's called The Popularization of Tarot, and it features the Catelin-Geoffroy, the Tarot of Paris, and the Metelli. Oddly enough, there is no Tarot de Marseille in this book, but it's still definitely worth having for the art history. So this is, I'll just do a quick little peek, and you can see this is from 1557. And the art is really gorgeous and really refined. So we'll look at it in more detail in a bit, but it is much more similar to this deck, and it really makes the 1559 date make a lot of sense. Now the thing is, though, that the backs are consistent with decks from 1650. So 1650 is when Vieilleville and Jean Noblet would have been creating cards. So they have these Maltese cross type backs. And the easy explanation for that, of course, is that the woodblocks were created in or around 1557, but that these cards were created using older woodblocks and then backed using the backing that was standard at the time. And just for a little more context, the earliest known TDM that we're aware of was the Vishir in 1639. So if this is from 1559, it predates the TDM style, which would make a lot of sense. The cards themselves are in pretty rough shape. It's pretty clear that the woodblocks are older, so when a woodblock engraving is created, the first printings are sharp and clear, but after decades, pieces break off, the edges become softer, and the images become more difficult to see. So between the fact that these woodblocks were worn out and the fact that the coloration done in the existing version of the deck is not exactly delicate, it makes these cards a little hard to interpret, which is why the Gergely Bogomary version of it is so helpful. So we will get to looking at that, but first let's go ahead and unbox this vintage deck. So this is a Grimaud, and it is a facsimile from the only surviving copy of this deck. And these in the past have been difficult to come by, but at times they can be gotten and aren't super pricey. Gosh, these are nice. The box is really high quality. Apparently the little white book is nothing special. It's in French and doesn't have much specific to this deck. I will check it out and confirm it on my own. Created in the early 17th century, this tarot is the oldest surviving example of a complete pack. Although the elements are those of a standard tarot pack, the originality of these cards lies in the magic of the drawings, the delicacy of their colors, and the wealth of their symbols. And that is very true. And you can see we've got this traditional back that would have been standard around the middle of the 1600s. And while the official date is early to mid 17th century, it's pretty widely accepted at this point that middle 16th century or about 1559 is probably when the art was created. And this is from 1985. And it does appear to be in an odd order. So I will go ahead and order this. And we'll go through these decks together. All right, I've got the Grimaud facsimile in the same order as the Midnight Tarot reproduction. And it's Tarot Midnight on Instagram, by the way, but the Etsy shop is called Midnight Tarot. And you can see already how much clearer this restoration is. So we're starting out with a Fool that is a really standard jester. He even is holding a marat. He's labeled but unnumbered, and you'll see throughout the deck that the spellings are really different. We do have a tax stamp here, which is present on all of the cards, I think. It's got a crown on it. And you can see that the details of the line work are really exceptional. The Grimaud facsimile is a satiny gloss. It's not a high gloss. You can see some shine. The Tarot Midnight restoration is rose petal, but not a super sticky rose petal. It's really nice. Both very nice cards, or decks. And the Tarot Midnight version is a little bit thicker, not by too much. This is the Magician, or Juggler, or as it's called in the Catelin-Geoffroy tarot, the Mountebank, because he is a kind of a trickster, maybe even a little bit of a fraud. So these are the two compared, very similar. And in this one you can see there is a monkey and a dog, and those are commonly a part of these kind of street magician acts, and are in fact commonly featured in art depicting this very scene. So I will insert a few images here of engravings from about the same time period. This one is a comparison from the Tarot History Facebook group, and I'll post links to all of these. And you can see Le Bateleur with his ass's ears hat and his monkey companion helping him with his tricks. This is from the mid-1400s, which is the case for all of these. And here's another similar theme. And these are woodblock cuts, not for cards, but intended as art pieces, possibly for publications. And one more, a bit more detailed engraving. You can see down in the right-hand corner there is an entertainer with a monkey on his shoulder, a musician, and a dog involved. And then we have a bateleur or conjurer at the table doing juggling tricks and such. In most of the engravings, the magician is the one with the ass's ears on his hat, which you can see here. So this is often considered the magician in this card, although it kind of looks like this guy is taking a more active role. So that's definitely up for interpretation. The monkey and dog were often part of the entertainment act doing tricks, but the monkey would also be able to hide the ball that was being juggled, things like that. So he was also in on the trickery. And you can see this dog is cleansing himself thoroughly, shall we say. And the monkey's just being a monkey. The Papess. There are a few decks out there that include these odd-looking figures as part of the throne, either in the Papess card or in the Pope card. And so I did a search this morning before work of a Pope throne in Renaissance art, and I came up with this image. And as you can see, this could very well be a precursor to the Papess imagery that we have. This is Pope Gregory I, who was Pope from 590 to 604 CE. And this is a copper plate engraving. Unfortunately, the only information I could find was on the Pope and not on the art itself. But we can see here that it bears a lot of resemblance to the Papess card with the curtain drapery and back, as well as the book in the engraving. This one being held by a faun figure or sculpture. And the arms of the chair or throne are sphinx-like creatures, which are probably the basis for some of the odd creatures we sometimes see on thrones in tarot cards, both for the Papess and the Pope cards. Now, I'm not sure if this was a common form for depictions of popes, or if this is a form that was unique to this particular artwork, and which would clearly be the basis for the Papess card. So that's definitely something that could be explored further and is super interesting. But you can see how without the beard and all of that, he could be misinterpreted as a feminine figure. And he was famous for a number of different writings, and so simplified versions of this engraving or other such engravings of him could definitely have been used in other publications and reused as tarot cards. There is a channel called Page of Swords. He's no longer posting. He has a video that I will link, a couple of videos on this deck, and he points out that the symbol of the papacy at that time was a gold key and a silver key crossed. So very often in the Pope and Papess cards, we'll see the gold or silver keys. In this one, the Papess is holding the silver key. I've seen others where it's the Pope doing so. The gestures in Renaissance art, the pointing, for example, are highly contextual. So in this case, this might sound weird, but a lot of times the reason for pointing is simply to direct the reader's gaze to maybe the subject of the art, or even to some kind of understanding of the symbolism. In this case, it seems strange the way she's holding the book, and if this is based on the image of St. George or similar imagery, this sounds weird, but it could be as simple as, hey, in the original image, this book should be over there, and pointing to where that book would normally be standing. That sounds weird, but if you look at a lot of Renaissance art, that's not too far off, and it is possible, but that's just an educated guess. Very sassy Empress card. And again, an example of really odd spelling. Now keep in mind, we're in the very earliest advent of the printing press. And there was no such thing as standardized spelling pre-printing press. And it took a while after the use of printing presses were established before spelling became at all standardized. That being said, though, the spelling in this deck is especially variable, let's just say. So that's supposed to say L'Empress or L'Imperatrice. And the women in this deck are really quite strong. When I first saw this, I even wondered, could this be a female artist who created this? We will possibly never know. All of the figures are more dynamic and in movement than what we're used to. So we have an armored, standing and possibly even striding forward emperor. And here is the Pope with the golden key. So a few things to point out here. We do have a Greek style sphinx. Now the word sphinx is a Greek word, but sphinx, like animals, any animal or creature that has an animal body and a human head, were common throughout antiquity, and there were different styles of them in different cultures. Their meaning in Renaissance art was variable, so it's hard to say. But as we saw in the image of St. George, it was not unheard of for a Greek sphinx and other mythological creatures to make an appearance in a portrait of a pope. Now, the Greek sphinx is not a guardian figure like we have in the case of an Egyptian sphinx. And unlike an Egyptian sphinx, it does have the head and bosom of a woman, whereas an Egyptian sphinx has the head of a male figure, unless it is in the tomb of a female pharaoh. So this Greek sphinx has the body of a lion, the head and bosom of a woman, and they give riddles. There is a legend of Oedipus, I think it is, who solves the riddle, and she perishes. I'll insert an image of that here. The other notable thing about this card is the presence of what appears to be a symbolism of stigmata on the back of his hands. Now, we're used to a cross representing possibly stigmata on the back of the Pope's hands. Some people interpret those as tattoos. Here we see a red circle, which is a little more on the nose. And we have a similar image in the Catelin-Geoffroy tarot, who is holding a silver key, by the way, as is the Papess. So I thought that was interesting, and I found this post that pointed out, I'll share the link in the description, it pointed out that these are ceremonial gloves. They're papal gloves. And here is an image. And those can either have a circular emblem or medallion or a cross. And they are placed on the hands to symbolize the stigmata. So that would be true of the TDM decks that we are used to seeing as well, but with crosses instead of these circular medallions. I have another book that I really enjoy, and it is The Secret Language of the Renaissance, Decoding the Hidden Symbolism of Italian Art. Now, the title bothers me because this isn't hidden symbolism. And this is the problem that I have with folks insisting that esotericism is inherent to the tarot. Because esotericism, by definition, is passing along secret knowledge to initiates. And it's really pretty elitist. Occult means secret knowledge, so that means hidden or secret. So esotericism is by nature something that is reserved for a select few. Largely, in my opinion, for marketing reasons, and that's why this book is titled the way it is. It's calling symbolism that was actually really well known at the time and perfectly out in the open, hidden and secret, just for marketing for the book. So by contrast, mysticism is the idea that every single one of us can have a direct relationship with the divine or with spirituality through, fairly simple but dedicated practices. So when I kind of try to separate tarot from esotericism, it isn't because I'm totally skeptical or totally against magic or anything like that. I'm a little bit skeptical, but I'm also open-minded. But it isn't about just magic or mysticism. It's about esotericism specifically and how it was really elitist. And honestly, all the other ists that you can think of. And I think by looking up the art that was common at the time, we can see that this deck of cards was not full of occult or secret knowledge, but was full of symbols that were really well known at the time. The people of the Renaissance were just swimming in a miasma of visual language that we have a hard time understanding now, simply because we didn't grow up in that context. So anyway, this is a really good book. I don't know enough about books on Renaissance art history to say if this is the best book to get. It's just one that was inexpensive on thrift books. And it's one that I really enjoy. So here is an image of a pope. This is Pope Innocent III from the early 1200s. That's not when this painting was made. These are some Medicis, very powerful, and I think he was related to them. But you can see here that he has those papal gloves with the red stigmata. And this scene should look pretty familiar. He is receiving a decree from the Franciscans. And these Franciscan monks look an awful lot like the supplicants in the Pope card that we are familiar with. So this painting is called Confirmation of the Franciscan Rule, made between 1483 and 1486 by Domenico Ghirlandaio. I am mispronouncing that for sure. But yeah, I thought that was a really relevant image. And I do like how the caption states that the triple tiara is what signifies him as the Pope. I love calling it a tiara. I think that's cool. So I will be bringing that book out a few times as we go through here. So my first time seeing this deck, again, there were so many strong women featured that I was kind of convinced it could be a female artist. And then I got to this card, and my first interpretation of it was that she was helping an infirm husband or other male relative. That is a definition of love that would come from a more feminine perspective, since women have traditionally been the caregivers in our society. So that was my first impression. Well, then I watched the video made by Page of Swords, and he pointed out that Renaissance humor was very bawdy, and that this is probably actually an amorous encounter. And it could even be a phallic joke, which we know were very popular in Renaissance and medieval Europe. So there I was being all naive, thinking this was a very sweet image of love and caring, but it might just be a hand job. I don't know. I did find a post comparing a Flemish tapestry that is very similar to this, with lovers under a tree. A little less spicy than this might be, and maybe this isn't as spicy. That's the way we're interpreting it. In my defense, though, there is precedence in Renaissance art for images of people taking care of the sick and infirm, such as this. I'm covering this up because he has kind of a gruesome injury. The only thing is, though, that this is a hospital and there are no women pictured. Even this fellow here is fairly feminine looking, but that is a nobleman in the middle there. So even so, it is possible my interpretation is right, but it's not likely. It's probably some kind of amorous encounter. This is a really interesting image. This is a chariot pulled by birds and driven by a cherubic figure and ridden by a more godlike figure. When I first saw it, I thought these must be storks. And then I looked into it, and there are quite a few depictions of Venus's chariot being pulled by either doves or swans. So I believe these are supposed to be swans, and Venus's chariot is also driven by Cupid. This is the Dominion of Venus from 1533, a beautiful engraving where you can see Venus in her chariot at the top throwing a spear, which is a bit warlike for her. And the chariot is driven by Cupid. He is firing an arrow at the front there. I've seen other examples, which I'm not finding at the moment, where he's more obviously driving the chariot, as we saw in the card. And this one is pulled by doves. And just as a side note, down at the bottom left, you'll see another example of a Greek sphinx being used as a decorative aspect. And on the bottom right, you'll see Atlas holding up the whole thing. I've got a copy of the Metelli deck here, and you can even see on the front, but let me take the cards out. So here, and in many of the Minchiadis and other tarots, the chariot is Venus. In this case, driven by doves, pulled by doves rather. And you can see the very delicate reins going up to her hands. And an example of billowing drapery behind her, which we see a lot in the Tarot of Paris, but it's a little more clear since this is a copper engraving and a later deck. So if this is Venus's chariot, who is this? It's often assumed to be Apollo. However, Venus and Mars are often seen together in an allegory showing love overcoming war. And that is true here. We see Venus's chariot. We see Mars actually chained to the chariot and submitting to Venus. This chariot is drawn by swans. And we see the muses there that often accompany Venus. And here is another depiction of the same allegory of love overpowering war. Mars here is reclining on his armor, which is symbolic of peace. And there are some fawns playing with his weapons and armor. One is even wearing his helmet. And he has been subdued by Venus. This fawn is blowing a conch in his ear, and he's not waking up. He is out cold. His strategically placed limp hand does mean what you think it means. And it's not even the only phallic joke in this painting. That javelin is strategically aimed toward a tree. And you know, Renaissance folks, they love their dick jokes. What can I say? And this is Mars and Venus by Botticelli from 1485. And here is another depiction of peace. She's labeled above her head as Pax. And you can see she is reclined on a set of armor. And this is really cool. It shows all sorts of the virtues. This book has a whole section of virtues and vices, and then they are referenced throughout the rest of the book. Oh, here we see Remus and Romulus with the she-wolf, a symbol of Rome. So I could do a whole video just on the virtues and vices from this book and some tarot cards, so I might do that. But again, here's peace, reclining on some armor. Now there is an image very similar to this with Apollo. It's from the 1700s, so if this was ever misinterpreted as Apollo, that could have influenced the later art. I'm not aware of other art like this that's definitely Apollo prior or at this time. And let me just show you here. These are Olympian gods. And these two fellows are Mars and Apollo. So you can see Apollo here draped in a toga or other drapery, but Mars wearing armor and a warrior's kilt. And he's the only one pictured with such a kilt, just as he's wearing here. So based on all of that, I think this is Mars. And that tracks with the symbolism of the chariot that we know today. As part of the triumphal traditions, it would be a victorious warrior driving his chariot home. And that tracks with Mars, I think, much more than Apollo. Now he is wearing a golden crown of laurels, which I think could be part of the confusion there, since he isn't wearing a helmet, but I'm inclined to think this is Mars having won out and taken Venus's chariot from her. I've turned on the overhead light, so we've got a little change in the lighting here. And here is the Justice card, which is, other than being standing and maybe moving and a little more dynamic, a pretty typical Justice representation, except for the double-sided head. And the other version of this deck that's available through Il Museo dei Tarocchi, the book apparently states that they believe this represents Athena being born out of Zeus's head, which is, again, another reason I decided not to get that book. They also misinterpreted the Greek Sphinx on the Pope card as a dog. So for a number of reasons, the fact that that came with a book didn't convince me to buy that deck. So let me tell you a little bit about the history of this representation, and to help us out with that, I've got the Lo Scarabeo Mantegna deck. Mantegna, rather, and it includes a number of the cardinal virtues, such as justice and prudence, which I'll show you in a moment, but it also includes some areas of study, like theology. And here we see her represented in a similar way. And here we start into the cardinal virtues. There's temperance and prudence. And she is depicted the way she typically is, in this case with a dragon instead of a serpent, but with a mirror. And she's got an old man's head behind hers, an old man's face on the back of her head. Now the reason for this, anytime that a figure was used to depict a concept, such as an area of study like theology, or a virtue like justice or prudence, if that concept requires good judgment, the ability to see both the context of the past and the future, and in this case with prudence, having good self-awareness, they would have the option of depicting that with an old man's face on the back of the primary head. And this comes from the symbolism of the god Janus. And we will look at this painting again. This is the same one where we saw Apollo and Mars. And here we see one of the Renaissance depictions of the god Janus, with his primary face being that of a young man, but also having the face of an old man on the back of his head. Now, more traditional Roman depictions didn't necessarily have a younger figure in the front. But Janus was the god of doorways. It's where we get the word January and janitor. And he had the ability to see both the past and the future simultaneously. And because of that, he had good judgment. So whenever there's a concept that requires good judgment, sometimes that figure representing that concept is given an extra face on the back of their head. Here is a beautiful engraving of Janus from 1550, holding a key indicating a gateway, and based on the position of his feet, probably a gateway between two different cities. And we also see typical Renaissance lions on his knees as decoration. He has two older faces rather than the younger and older. And in this case, since Justice is blind, they have a blindfold big enough for both of them, which I think is pretty cool. And this card is Hermit. It is depicted in the form of a monk with a set of rosary beads, but he is labeled as a hermit. And his lantern often gets misinterpreted. So I've seen people think that this is an hourglass or a bell. We do often see an hourglass. It's definitely not a bell, though. This is a lantern. And it's just an older style of lantern that has a handle on the side. And we see that in the Metelli deck, not in the Hermit card, which in this deck is Father Time, but we do see it here in the Star card. And while you can't see the handle at this angle, you can see that these are the same type of lantern. And it's just an older style that predated the type of lantern that has a handle on top. Now, at the time that this art was created in the mid-1500s, the other type of lantern with the handle did exist, and we see that here in the Catelin-Geoffroy Hermit, who is also depicted as a monk. And he has a similarly structured lantern, but this one does have the handle above. So it's just a different style of lantern. This Wheel of Fortune depiction has some very King of the Mountain vibes, which I appreciate. And you can see the crank here that can be turned by fortune or one of her compatriots. But in this case, we only see the individuals who are going for a ride on the wheel. Lovely details in this strength card, or fortitude. And fortitude is in older versions depicted with a pillar, which we do see here. This one is broken and she's standing on top of it. And we see the lion. And she's got this billowing drapery behind her, which is present in many of the cards. The details in the hair and the clothing of this deck are truly remarkable. The Hanged Man. To me, he looks like Pythagoras, who was considered a traitor in his time. One of the more notable things about this card is the really strange spelling. But we're used to that by now. Lamort is labeled. That's unusual. And the Page of Swords in his video, he pointed out, he interpreted this as a tree that had been cut, but was growing some new branches. And that would be a really appropriate set of symbolism for the Death card. Great face. And with the decorative drapery to add dramatic effect. This is a really cool Temperance, spelled Trempance. But she's only got one vessel of water and she's using it to very skillfully put out this fire. You can even see the smoke and steam rising from the fire that she's extinguishing. How cool is that? And a pretty cool devil. He's got a rake for raking sinners over the coals. And he's holding a chain. Sometimes the devil in these older decks has his legs chained together. Or of course in the TDM, the imps are chained. This guy's just holding a chain as a symbol. And we have lightning. Like many of the older decks, it's not labeled as the Tower or the House of God, but the Maison Dieu, but labeled as La Foudre or lightning. But it doesn't depict lightning, it's depicting a hellmouth. So this is a common depiction for the mouth of hell as a monster. So it's not unheard of to picture a hellmouth on a tarot deck, such as in the Vacetta. In this case, it is the Devil card. And this is more of a lion type creature, but it tends to have these flat teeth along with some fangs. Some of them do have all sharp teeth. But that is a very standard Renaissance symbol and was actually often used in theater to make some scary gates of hell. And we see it too in the Trionfi della Luna, of which I have the full spectrum version, but in this case, it's Judgment. But again, a very standard hellmouth depiction. Hellmouth is often depicted as a leviathan, which is a sea monster. We might think of it as a whale, but you can see that this is the style of hellmouth here. This is a long snout, the eye, which looks rather like a whale's eye, and you can see those flat teeth here, and the fangs, and then the bottom jaw here, and then flames. Then we have imps torturing people. This might be somebody with a set of horns, or it might be somebody with braids being tortured. The unusual aspect of this Hellmouth is this figure leading people out. Now, it is common for a Hellmouth to be depicted with Jesus leading people out, but not this devilish drummer. So it's very strange. The most recognizable depiction of somebody playing an instrument and leading someone out of hell or Hades or the underworld is the story of Orpheus and his wife Eurydice, which is pictured as the lightning card in the Catelin-Geoffroy tarot. So Orpheus lost his wife Eurydice, and he was permitted to go down into the underworld by Hermes and retrieve her. And he was a musician. He played his lyre or other stringed instrument on the way out, and the agreement was he had to trust Hermes. He was not to look back at Eurydice to make sure she was behind him. If he did, he would lose her again. And he didn't trust Hermes, and he looked back, and here is him looking back, and the devil, or Hades, taking Eurydice. And here we do have a depiction of a tower. Now, the tower depictions were often either the house of God or the house of the devil in a more satirical sense. So my thought is perhaps this is more of a house of the devil satirical type depiction, and that this could be some satire around the legend of Orpheus and Eurydice, as well as the depictions of the big JC leading people out of Hades. I'm not really sure. But my search history is so weird on my phone right now, y'all. I've got like Latin inscriptions on there for translation. I have like Hellmouth as a whale, and I've got Jesus playing a drum. So I was trying to figure this out. I couldn't find any other depiction of anybody playing a drum around a Hellmouth, and no depictions of Jesus playing a drum, at least not Renaissance ones. There are some really weird modern ones, oddly enough. So I will share with you a few other images of Hellmouths so you get an idea of what they looked like. Here is a stained glass roundel from 1500, and you can see it is a combination of a Hellmouth and a tower. This one is the Jaws of Hell with Lucifer and Satan from 1568. And this is the Fall of the Rebel Angels from 1430. And I'll put links to posts with all of these in the comments. Here is a somewhat more whale-like Hellmouth. This is probably the one I could find that was most similar to this card. And it's from a fresco of the Last Judgment from 1555. And look right above the Leviathan's head, and you'll see a Wheel of Fortune being cranked by a demon. This is a more chaotic Hellmouth that has a similar energy to the one in this card. And finally, one more whale-like Leviathan style. And yeah, this is a really remarkable card. I think it is intended to be humorous and satirical, like a lot of playing card depictions are. And the star. We've got a image of an astronomer using tools, and that's important because the main astronomer depicted using tools in the Renaissance was Tycho Brahe, who was Danish. I think I misattributed his nationality as Swedish. I'm Swedish, so, or my ancestry is anyway, so maybe that's bias on my part. So I want to definitely give the Danes credit for Tycho Brahe. But it was a major discovery that he made by scaling up nautical measurement devices. He was able to get the most accurate measurements of celestial bodies pre-telescope. And we can assume that there would have been books and circulars, as in newspapers, with woodblock engravings used to depict him, and that those would be available for reuse as a tarot card, which was often done. Many of the images we have on tarot cards have been reused from other sources. It does say DESE on here. Let's see if I can get that to. The S is backwards, but I think that's D-E-S-E. And I guess there's a Venetian phrase, D-E-S-E, desa means these, and it's desa libri, which is these books. So I think this is a stack of books that are just labeled these books, as far as I can tell. And you can see that he's on a rooftop doing his work. And our moon card is somebody serenading a figure in the window, which is a common trope. And we see it in other tarot cards. The one JJ Swiss has a moon card with somebody serenading a figure in the window. It doesn't have to do with Romeo and Juliet, though. Romeo never did serenade Juliet. They did speak poetry to each other from the window. And he did climb into her window, but he never played an instrument for her. But in theater and stories, playing an instrument for someone in the window was common. What's not common is for the lady in the window to be nude, which makes me think, you know, in keeping with the style of Renaissance symbolism, a nude figure is often symbolic of either a deity or a concept or something like that. And we also see a child on a wolf, which, you know, I'm going to assume is Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome. And here we have an Egyptian sphinx, or what appears to be an Egyptian sphinx. Now, it's a little questionable if you look at the original. And the restoration by Il Museo dei Tarocchi, it doesn't really look like Gergely's restoration, which really does make it look like an Egyptian sphinx. Now, whether it's an Egyptian sphinx or not, it is something that appears to have a human head and a lion paw, therefore an animal body. So it's some kind of sphinx. And as we'll see later, we have at least one other type of sphinx from another part of the world pictured later. So one thing about this deck is that it borrows from tarot traditions from all over Europe, it borrows mythology from all over the world, and it has coats of arms from multiple different countries. So it's suspected that it may have been intended to appeal for a wider audience. So we're getting right at the beginning of a time when things could be mass-produced with a printing press and distributed from port cities all around the world. So it's possible that this artist wanted this tarot deck to be the universal widely distributed tarot deck, and that didn't happen. Instead, that did happen to the Tarot de Marseille. But can you imagine if this had been our standard tarot deck from which so many other tarots were created? So it is possible that this is an Egyptian sphinx. That art style would have been known at the time, and it would make sense to have sphinxes from 3 different cultures, and we'll see the third one in a little bit. That being said, though, I'm not super convinced that's what this is, because in the original it doesn't totally look like that. But I think that's a reasonable depiction by Gergely. Now, why would this person be flanked by Romulus and an Egyptian sphinx? So we're going to put our educated guess hats on and go into conjecture land. But this could represent empire. You know, we have 2 of the best known empires of the time, Egyptian and Roman. So maybe this person represents empire, and since this is the moon card, maybe we can assume that's Diana. She's a warrior goddess. So maybe, and you know, she's a huntress, but also involved with war. And considering how allegorical images tend to be in the Renaissance, it's very possible that this is empire making an entreaty to Diana, maybe for strength or prowess on the battlefield. The only reason to think that might be Diana, though, is because it's the moon card. There's no other indication that that's Diana. So I have no idea, in honesty, but that's a possibility. Now, this is an interesting sun card. And it is often compared to images of Venus looking in the mirror, in which the mirror is often held by Cupid or by another small winged creature called an amoretta. But in this case is being held up by a giant monkey, which seems pretty odd. But if we look into Renaissance art a little bit, we'll find some parallels. So first, let me show you Titian's depiction of Venus in the mirror. And that is often either said to be honoring feminine beauty, or it could be criticizing vanity, depending. Most depictions of it do have her in front of a curtain on a bed with drapery. So there is some question of what the heck is this thing here? And you can see in Gergely's restoration, it does look like a club or a baton. But I'm not so sure. I really think that it's intended to be a curtain. But I can totally see why people would think that it might be a club. Remember, the coloration came later, and this red dot could easily be a coincidental mistake from some coloration that was not very delicately done. That makes it look like a club. But I do concede that it looks quite a lot like a club, but it would make more sense for it to be a curtain. Now, what about this monkey, though? And for that, let's bring out the book again. All right, so this is an allegorical painting by Mantegna and commissioned by Isabella d'Este. So those are some names you might recognize. The Mantegna deck is attributed to Mantegna, not actually created by him, but this is. And there is also an Estensi deck that was commissioned by the Este family of Ferrara, and this is that same family. So you can see that the art commissioned and created in the tarot was similar to a lot of the art commissioned and created in the greater Renaissance context. So this is an allegory. It's the Garden of the Mind, and it has been, it was inhabited by the virtues. Here we have three of them, three of the cardinal virtues: temperance, fortitude, and justice. And so you can see here that it wasn't unheard of to depict these three together without Prudence. So some of the older decks do include Prudence, but the TDM and tarots that stemmed from it do not. So where is Prudence? Well, according to this inscription, she's imprisoned here. And apparently she was considered the mother of the virtues, and it was impossible to develop the other virtues, the other three cardinal virtues, or any of the other virtues, without first developing Prudence. This painting was created as an instructional course for Isabella d'Este. And so it was basically telling her how to act. So this is the Garden of the Mind. The virtues have been banished or imprisoned. Here we have Daphne. She's horrified. She represents chastity here. And they've been banished by Venus and all these vices. And here we have the little Amoretti. So if you see, sometimes we'll see Cupid in the love card with these colorful wings. And so probably it's actually an Amoretta rather than Cupid himself. But Venus is astride a centaur, which represents the primal urges of humans, which are supposed to be controlled according to this philosophy or worldview. This is ignorance, which is crowned and rules the world, being carried out by avarice and ingratitude. It took me a minute to remember that. So this is Pallas Athena, also known as Minerva, chasing the vices out of the Garden of the Mind. Some of these depictions are offensive in an ableist way. So we have idleness depicted here, being led by inertia. And that's not a pleasant image. It's a little offensive. But then we have all these little fauns and other mythological beings being chased out by Minerva or Pallas Athena. And the Amoretti are challenging her chastity by firing arrows at her. So in previous depictions, we saw Venus being portrayed as love over, conquering war. Here she's portrayed as lust. So she has different symbologies depending on the context. And who do we have here but the giant humanoid monkey? And why am I calling it a monkey? Wouldn't that just be an ape? It's because that's what everybody calls it. So I guess art historians are not biologists. So we're going with monkey. It's giant though. This type of figure could represent a number of things. In this case, it's actually labeled, which helps. It says, The monkey is often associated with lust, but the inscriptions borne by this creature tell us it represents immortal hatred, fraud, and malice. The bags tied around its body contain the evils it spreads. So that's kind of terrible, but you can see if you look closely, it does have bags. So coming back to this, we have a precedent for this type of imagery. So that kind of backs up the idea that this is Venus looking in her mirror, and it's satirical. Instead of Cupid holding up the mirror to her, it's this giant monkey being, which could represent vanity in this case. It is the sun card, so it could represent bringing things to light that maybe we don't want to bring to light, which is interesting. As far as her pointing goes, again, pointing is super contextual. In this case, it's very common for somebody to point to the subject of the painting. So she could be pointing like, hey, look at that giant monkey. That sounds silly, but it's definitely a possibility. Pointing down can mean that the subject of this painting is regarding earthly affairs. It can also mean damnation. So that's up to interpretation. And I will show you another image here of a similar gesture. So a really unique sun card, for sure. And it kind of mirrors, if you will, the image of a monkey looking in a mirror that we sometimes see on the pips of older decks like Minchiati. A pretty familiar Judgment card, very strange spelling. And I have found other depictions of Judgment where one of them is a skeleton. This guy isn't totally a skeleton. He's kind of a Skeletor looking guy though, which I really love. He even has that stance of Skeletor when he gets frustrated when He-Man wins. But it is a really beautiful and dynamic angel, touching one toe to the earth. And the World card. You can see the globe with the cityscape, which we see in a number of older decks like the Minchiati. And those are often called Fame, but here it is labeled the World. We have the four winds. And this curtain might mean that this is the goddess Nyx pulling the veil of night over the earth. But what's really interesting about this, and you may have noticed throughout this whole deck, we have this decorative cartouche with the Roman numerals and lions on either side. Now remember for context that these cards were created before or around 1650, even if the woodblocks were created likely in 1559. But the deck itself is contemporary with the Via Ville and the Noble. Now the Via Ville is an interesting blend. It's considered to be a precursor to the Rouen-Brussels pattern, which you can see here. The Rouen-Brussels cards often have feathered fancy horses. They also tend to have a lightning card with the tree and shepherd, as well as the astrologer for a star card, and the spinner for the moon. It does have characteristics that are more similar to the TDM decks though, such as the World card. But I'm just mentioning that to put it in context. So this deck was printed right about the time that we have the precursor to the Rouen-Brussels pattern, the peak of which is the Vandenbora Tarot, which is a Bacchus and Fracas deck, like the other Rouen-Brussels. These were popular in areas that were Protestant, so the Pope and Papess were replaced, and same goes for the Besançon decks. In the Rouen-Brussels pattern, Pope and Papess are usually replaced by Bacchus and Fracas. This is also known as the Spanish captain, and one of his character forms is Fracas or Fracasse. He's a character from Commedia dell'arte, which is an Italian style of theater, which was very bawdy and humorous and spread throughout Europe and eventually turned into other forms of theater, such as the Punch and Judy show. And that is a visual pun, and his hilt does represent what you think it represents. So Renaissance folks have got jokes, and they're often dick jokes. I don't make the rules. The reason I bring this out is to show you the world card. So this is just, you notice on all these other triumphs, there's no cartouche. Only on the world card do we have the very same cartouche that we find on the Tarot of Paris. And the world card itself takes a very similar form. It doesn't have all four winds, but the globe and cross or hilt decoration are the same. The central figure is very similar. It is winged in the Vandenbora, but it has a similar curtain, possibly the curtain of night, being drawn over by the goddess Nyx. So it's just kind of a little quirk that about the time that the Rouen-Brussels pattern was being developed, that we have this deck printed from woodblocks that were probably much older, but still. And it's important to note that there were thousands of tarot cards printed during these time periods, and we only have a tiny fraction that survived. So we can create timelines by lining up different decks and seeing the development from one to the other, but we don't necessarily have all the pieces of the puzzle. In fact, we definitely don't have all the pieces of the puzzle. So it's a little bit of a question of how did this world card make it into the Rouen-Brussels pattern? It's a very interesting question. And there we have it for the triumphs of this remarkable deck. I'll go through the courts and pips a little quicker. All of the aces are banners brandished by an animal or a mythological creature. For the coins, it is a lion. And the coins are the suit that contain many of the heraldry and coats of arms that allowed this deck to be dated at an earlier time. And again, I'll share that link in the description. Now, they also contain some symbolism that occultists like to attribute to esoteric secrets, but they aren't. Every single coat of arms in this deck has been identified. But we also see for the first time here why this is called the Anonymous Tarot of Paris. So we do have in the original where it says made in Paris by, and then this part looks to me like it's scratched off. And that supports the idea that these are very old wood blocks that were sold or otherwise changed hands, and the name of the artist or creator was removed. Now, the three crescent moons are one of the ones that esotericists like to think is some occult symbolism, but it's not. It's three crescent moons were very common heraldry at the time. And these, I didn't go into too much detail studying these coats of arms, but they are from all over Europe, which again supports the idea that the artist wanted this to be somewhat of a multicultural, widely appealing deck. These really are beautiful. But this is another one that esotericists think are magical sigils. Right there. Those are actually golden chains. Here's the first seal of Charles III, 1409. And you can see both the golden chains and fleur-de-lis symbols, which represent the families of Navarre and Evreux, and they are combined. And next we have the private seal of Charles III, also 1409, with similar imagery. It does have a Latin inscription that could be interpreted as being magical, since it says Sigillum Secretum Caroli Regis Navarre, but that just means private seal of Charles, King of Navarre. So this would be the seal used for personal communication, rather than the previous, which would be used for more public decrees and things like that. The Four of Coins is another example of a place where the name has been scratched off, and where Gergely Bagamery has inserted his name as the restorer of this deck. I do want to point out this pattern here, which we often see on the backs of decks. That is an ermine pattern. And it is the coat of arms of Brittany, a region in France. And we can see it here on the backs of this artisan dodal. And I am going to share a video made by Ellen from Lumen Tarot because she is hand making a deck where she hand paints the backs. I think she hand painted one of them and then copied them for the rest. But I'll share that video because it's amazing. But an ermine is the winter coat of a stoat. The summer coat is sable. And we often see this pattern lining cloaks of royalty, such as in the Tarot Renan. We have a few depictions of ermine cloaks, as in this Queen of Coins. She also has some fleur-de-lis in the lining of her cloak. But this is a white fur with black markings. And you can see in the ones where there are quarters, it's often when two coats of arms are blended for marriage. The boat one is pretty cool. One interesting thing about the pips is that they are labeled with Arabic numerals. Arabic numerals are pretty new to Europe at this point. These depictions by Tarot Midnight really do us a service. That is so difficult to see, but these are so much clearer. This one was reversed. So this is one of the 3 intertwining crescent moon images that esotericists like to latch onto. But I'll show an example of where that's used. It's actually a really common decorative motif. So I'll insert an image here. Look at the detail. This artist was very talented. And I would just absolutely love to see somebody recreate this deck with the original line work, not modernizing it or anything like that, turning all the fierce women in it into delicate little princesses, but keeping the line work and then coloring it in a hand-painted style, kind of like the Solabusca. Can you imagine how beautiful that would be? That would be a lot of work. So this is interesting. He's pointing down. He is the valet of coins. And here, pointing down could refer to, this is concerning earthly matters, which makes a lot of sense with coins, at least in the way that they're often interpreted in modern times. The cartouche at the top has the initials of Fonte de Denier rather than valet. Valet has an interesting spelling. So yeah, it kind of points to either Italian or Spanish labeling in addition to the French labeling. Of course, that wouldn't show up in the night because Italian would be cavalier, and then we have chevalier spelled out for the bottom, both of which start with a C. But the details are just amazing. Try and go through them pretty quickly so that I can fit this whole video on my camera. So feel free to pause if you want to check out any of these details. A whole lot of lions on elbows and knees in this deck. Cups, there is a stag as a standard bearer. And then in the Two of Cups, you can see where it says, made in Paris by, and then there's a place for a name, and it is gone. And this reedité, I assume, means revised or restored by Gergely Bagamary. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. And the cups are absolutely gorgeous. The details are just amazing. Every single one is different, just like with the coins. They're each unique and incredibly detailed. So this was really a talented artist, whoever made these. There's a sassy valet of cups. Very stylish in clothing as well. The horses in this deck are gorgeous. Really beautiful and dramatic Queen of Cups with her flowing hair and the billowing drapery behind her. More lions on the legs, but a wolf on the arm. Swords. We've got a unicorn standard bearer whose horn is clashing with this scimitar. And all of the swords are this style, which are pretty badass. This protective handle here apparently was common at the time, according to the videos by Page of Swords, which I will link in the description. And these are typical pip patterns. They're crossed, so they're similar to the Portuguese style. The fact that they are divided into sections like this have convinced some occultists that it's the as above, so below patterning that we find in the Udapakar deck, for example. Udapakar's pips are based on these shapes, but these shapes aren't occult in meaning. They are very common. We even find them in modern decks of cards with French pips. One of the varieties of shapes that we find in pips throughout Europe. I love this one, the complexity of the way the swords are crossed, especially on the top. And the pips are one of the ways in which a variety of styles from around Europe are incorporated, again, to make this deck appealing to a wide audience, one would assume. This is really cool. The movement is so lovely. They almost look like they're dancing. The valets tend to be on the older side in this deck, often bearded or at least mustachioed, as in the Valet of Swords. He's got a very cool snake belt. Okay, this is a little bit odd, where we can't see the front of the horse. What happened to him? And this horse is probably rearing, but this position is one that we find in other decks, such as in the Metelli Knight of Cups. In this case, the horse is standing, so we can see the front legs. We can't see the head at all. We do see the reins, indicating that the horse does have a front. In this case, those details have been lost. Perhaps they were once there and broke off. There are parts of the woodblock that seem to have broken off. This could be the feather on the top of the horse's head. There is an odd shape here, and it's hard to tell what that portrays. That could be the horse's neck. There may have been forelegs visible in the original woodcut, but we'll never know. So for now, we just have a horse's ass on the Knight of Swords. This is probably the coolest queen in this deck. Not to be disloyal to my beloved Queen of Batons, but this is awesome. I do love her. The whole court of swords is pretty ferocious. It's kind of cool. And this standard bearer is often referred to as a griffin, but it has a human head, so it's not a griffin, it is a sphinx. It's not a Greek sphinx or an Egyptian sphinx, though, but looks more like either a Sumerian or Assyrian sphinx, which may have been referred to as Lamassu. These sphinxes have lions' bodies and eagles' wings. Sometimes they have the bodies of bulls, and then the head of a masculine human. They don't often have birds' feet. Some sphinxes do. There are Greek sphinxes that have vultures' feet, and even a serpent as a tail. But I'll insert a picture of an Assyrian Lamassu for you. These were more protective, like the Egyptian sphinxes, so they were found at gates of palaces and cities. And this isn't the first time I've seen a Sumerian or Assyrian style sphinx. Sumeria and Assyria were both Mesopotamian cultures, Sumeria being the older one. They were both distinct, they had their own languages and things like that, but they shared a lot of imagery, and Mesopotamia being modern day Iraq. There is a deck somewhere that has two sphinxes drawing the chariot, but their heads are Sumerian in style. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. So if you remember it, let me know. But yeah, so we have possibly our third style of sphinx from a third culture. And this is pretty neat, where we have the eagle or vulture claws holding the two of batons. This is possibly another place where a name could have appeared. And I will flip through these pretty quickly before I run out of camera. And I hope that gives you some more context to help make sense of this deck. I almost wish I could go back to the first time I saw it and my mind was blown by it and I thought, this can't be real. But now that I have looked at the deck thoroughly and looked at a lot of art and given it context and scoured the internet for information about this deck, it makes a whole lot more sense to me. I think it's possible that the first versions of it were exquisite. This version of it is made with old, worn-out wood blocks, where a lot of the details are lost, and the coloration is indelicately done. But imagine if the original ones with sharper wood blocks were hand-painted. They would just be absolutely exquisite, and I would just love to see that. This queen does have some amazing side-eye, so while I think the Queen of Swords in this deck is the best, I still absolutely adore my beloved Queen of Batons. And look at that no-nonsense baton she's got there. She could do some damage with that. And the King of Batons looking a little unsure, as he often is. Like, my dear, what are you going to do with that thing? But he has kind of a big-ass baton himself, so... Well, that is my deep dive of the Tarot of Paris. I'm sure I missed some of the things I wanted to say, so I can always do a follow-up, I suppose. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that helped you make some sense of this amazing deck. And I hope you enjoyed seeing Gergely Bogomeri's restoration. He really did us a service by providing some clarity for this incredible deck. As always, I sure do appreciate your time. I hope you enjoyed this, and please do share this. I put a lot of work into this, and I would love for it to be seen. So if you know anyone who is interested in tarot history, or are part of any groups or forums that discuss tarot history, I would love for people to be able to see this. I would love to hear differing perspectives too. I'm not a professional historian by any stretch of the imagination, so if folks have perspectives different from mine, I would love to learn from that. And if you have any thoughts at all, please do comment down below. I sure appreciate it. And again, thank you so much for your time. I will talk to you next time.